So perhaps in terms of why do we engage with stakeholders, may I ask Aranzazu to shed some more light on this before I ask the different participants to perhaps share their views and their own experiences, and as we go along the discussion for this morning. Aranzazu?
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. And I think the previous speakers have already given a very important insights on why we are talking about the stakeholder engagement in the context of this audit of preparedness for SDG implementation. So I will try to go back to our reference, which is the 2030 Agenda, and taking from that how the 2030 Agenda sees stakeholder engagement, why this is relevant for this audit of preparedness, and some of the challenges also that we may find. And I was also doing my recap this morning, and yesterday we talked about society and whole of society and civil society and multi-stakeholder partnerships. And we talk about government and whole of government and government agencies and local governments, national statistical offices, supreme audit institutions, parliaments, INTOSAI, women, girls, migrants, so United Nations. So all these are critical actors, relevant actors in this universe of the SDGs. So I think it's a good time to reflect on the importance of engaging with these different stakeholders and how can we do that. So I think it's to begin with looking at the process that led to the agenda. One of the distinctive features of the agenda is that it's the result of a participatory process. So, of course, governments, member states were engaged, but also civil society, NGOs, what we call in the UN lingo major groups, so representatives from different sectors of society, private sector, they were involved in the negotiation process as well. And in a session just a few days ago at the high-level political forum, one of these civil society representatives involved in the process said, well, this agenda belongs to all of us. It's not an agenda only of governments. So there is a strong sense of ownership also among other stakeholders, non-government, non-state stakeholders. Building on this participatory process, the agenda calls for multi-stakeholder engagement in the implementation of the SDGs in all the different stages, from adapting the agenda to the national context, identifying indicators, setting the priorities at the national level, defining the implementation strategies, and the follow-up and review. And it recognizes the importance of participatory processes for sustainable development. Some specific goals and targets recognize this importance of stakeholder engagement. The most clear example is target 16.7, which calls for responsive, transparent, inclusive, participatory decision-making at all levels, but also looking at the specific issue areas, specific goals, for example, water or urban planning and management. There are also specific targets that recognize the importance of engaging stakeholders. And non-state stakeholders. Also in the follow-up and review process, the agenda emphasizes that these processes must be open, inclusive, transparent, and participatory, and with a particular focus on the poorest and the most vulnerable sectors and those farthest behind. Building on what the agenda says, we are seeing that action is already happening. So governments are already engaging with different stakeholders, and non-state stakeholders are also mobilizing around the agenda. So in the implementation, for example, we heard yesterday from Finland on this whole of society approach to implementation. In the Philippines, civil society was involved in the development of the indicators and identifying the national indicators. In Norway, the indigenous parliament of the Sami people, they will be involved in the implementation process, working with line ministries. So there are many examples around the world of the actions that governments are already taking to engage with the stakeholders. And civil society is also mobilizing around this agenda, advocating for SDG implementation plans, producing parallel monitoring reports of what is happening at the national level. We saw in the high-level political forum, which finished just 2 days ago, over 2,000 non-state stakeholders were registered. Countries are involving different stakeholders in the follow-up and review process. And we had Carlos from TCU yesterday, and he was part of the Brazilian official delegation to the high-level political forum, which also had representatives from parliament and from civil society. So this is already happening. And I think what is important is that this is not new to Supreme Audit institutions either. As we saw yesterday and today, when conducting your audits, you engage with government agencies, public officials in different capacities, in different sectors and areas. And more importantly, as we know from the case of the Philippines and many others, in the last years, Supreme Audit institutions have made significant progress in engaging with non-state stakeholders and with other relevant external stakeholders like parliaments. There has been, especially after the adoption of ISAI 12 in 2013, where there is also specific principles and objectives for Supreme Audit institutions to be more transparent, more accountable, to be more relevant to the people in their countries. Many experiences from the community of Supreme Audit institutions are being implemented in terms of engaging with the media more actively through proactive communication strategies, involving citizens in conducting audits, like the citizen participatory audits in the Philippines, setting complaint mechanisms for citizens to be able to submit information and identify risk areas for Supreme Audit institutions. So we have a lot of experience in the Supreme Audit institutions in this room. So how do we build on this experience in order to engage with the stakeholders in this audit of preparedness? And I think we need to distinguish two different dimensions that might be relevant. On the one hand, Supreme Audit institutions can look at how governments are engaging with different stakeholders in preparing for SDG implementation and in the implementation process. On the other hand, Supreme Audit institutions themselves, when doing this kind of audit, SDG-related audits, it's very important also that they communicate with and engage with different stakeholders. What are the benefits of this? Why is this important? I think we have heard two important benefits from the previous speakers. From the Philippines, the information that the stakeholders can provide the Supreme Audit institutions. Non-state stakeholders, people, citizens on the ground, they have very relevant information in terms of how programs work in practice. Whether services are effectively delivered. They are really the beneficiaries and also the monitoring agents of SDG implementation on the ground. So information, stakeholders as providers of critical information for the Supreme Audit institution, and we heard from Claire regarding the impact of audits and how other stakeholders can leverage the information produced by Supreme Audit institutions and enhance the impact of these audits. And let me add one more, and is that as we saw yesterday, and we will be discussing today, this agenda cannot be implemented by governments only. It requires a coordinated action by many, many different actors. And if we need a whole-of-government approach to do this kind of audit, we also need this whole of society, we also need to engage with all these different stakeholders. But this is not so easy. I think there are some complexities and challenges. Some have been discussed for a long time within the INTOSAI community, and Claire referred to those issues of independence, potential risk in terms of the Supreme Audit Institution being perceived as biased in a particular direction. Also very practical issues of workload, capacities, skills, and resources. But I think there are also some specific challenges for Supreme Audit institutions when looking at how governments are engaging with stakeholders and doing this kind of, or incorporating this dimension in this kind of audits. And one question is which stakeholders? And I think one important aspect is that Supreme Audit institutions will have to consider and map a wide variety of stakeholders which are involved in SDG implementation. So we really need to consider all the multiple actors out there. We need to consider the interlinkages between different areas, as we saw yesterday, for example, in the presentation from Brazil. If we are doing an audit related to organic food, as they were thinking at the beginning, it's not only about the stakeholders or the actors involved in that particular area, but also all those interrelated areas that were mapped yesterday in the presentation we saw. Each of those actors can be the provider of a very critical piece of information and will have a different perspective on that particular SDG or on the preparedness of the government in that particular area. So let me just conclude with kind of 3 key messages that I think might be relevant for the discussion as an input for our discussion today. One is that stakeholder engagement will not be the same across all the Supreme Audit institutions because it's not the same across all different countries. So Supreme Audit institutions need to look at their own context, their organizational context, their mandates, their capacities, resources, see what is the scope of stakeholder engagement, how they can collaborate with other actors and engage with other actors in doing this kind of audit. But also, I think it's critical to keep in mind that it's important and valuable to have a systematic approach to engage with different stakeholders in this kind of audit from the planning stage. Not only for the dissemination of the report, but from the planning process when conducting the audit, and then for the dissemination and follow-up as well. A second message is that, yes, it's going to be difficult. We will have one of these maps that we saw yesterday with many different stakeholders, agencies. But I think there are relevant audit criteria that can be used to assess whether and how governments are engaging with stakeholders. And we can look at some of the general standards in terms of the structures and the processes for engaging different stakeholders and actors in public policies and programs, and also at the emergent good practices. And we have heard these days, and we will be hearing from different actors on this. And the final point is, as I mentioned before, the value of strategic communication. When you finally do this audit and you have an audit report related to the SDGs, I think there is potentially it will have great social impact because society is mobilizing around the SDGs. So I think it's important for Supreme Audit institutions to also consider and I know that this involves both risks and opportunities. So we need to be careful about that. But I think it's important also to think through this process of the audit about communication, strategic communication, what are the different audiences for this kind of reports, what are the different channels or the different communication tools that we can use to reach out to those audiences. And again, I think there are very good examples in this room of how Supreme Audit institutions have been doing that already.